Muy buenos días, muy buenos días a todas y todos. Buenas tardes allá en Francia. La doctora Sthepahnie Abdala nos complace con su compañía el día de hoy. Ella es una destacada investigadora del CNRS y trabajando, ahora está trabajando en otra instancia, ¿verdad, doctora? Está en la Escuela Nacional de Altos Estudios, ¿verdad? En Francia.
Sí, en el CNRS, pero en la escuela también sabes, porque el CNRS tiene centros en las universidades y esa es una de unas universidades de ciencias sociales. Mm,
En Francia.
mm.
Y su trabajo más influyente en ese ámbito, pues es su libro History of Confinement in Palestine, The Prison Web, que es donde acuña el concepto de red carcelaria, que es el concepto del cual también nos va a hablar, en el que se sostiene que hay un sistema de encarcelamiento israelí contra los palestinos que no se limita a los muros de la prisión, sino que funciona como un sistema de control extendido que gestiona la movilidad de toda la población palestina. Ella también ha trabajado cuestiones relacionadas con la sociedad civil palestina y les quiero decir que gracias a la doctora Sthepahnie, gracias a ella y a su trabajo que hizo con varias cooperativas en Nablus, en Nayá, con la Universidad de Nayá, yo pude entrar a Palestina por primera vez. Y ella fue y sigue siendo un referente para muchos colegas palestinos y palestinas que viven allá en Cisjordania. Y su trabajo, pues, ha sido pionero en trabajos de carácter antropológico con respecto a Palestina. Y al final de cuentas, ahora tuvimos la oportunidad de reencontrarnos en Guatemala junto con el doctor Daniel Abundis, que también lo veo aquí conectado y le mando un fuertísimo abrazo. Y compartimos también la presentación de este libro y de estas ideas que son muy fuertes, pero necesarias de saber. Doctora Sthepahnie, muchísimas gracias por estar aquí con nosotros en este seminario que impulsamos la doctora Márgara Millán en la Facultad de Ciencias Políticas, la Cátedra Jorge Alonso, el CLACSO y nuestro seminario de estudios sobre Palestina de la Facultad de Ciencias Políticas y Sociales y otros colectivos como Académicos por Palestina que tratamos de seguir estudiando este tema a pesar de las adversidades, de las violencias y de los filtros que hay para esto. Por favor, doctora, muchísimas gracias por estar aquí. If you want to speak in English or Spanish is very well, both of you. I mean, you can choose whatever language you want in the language that you feel comfortable. Thank you very much, Professor.
Muchas gracias, Moisés, y todos las colegas y los de... por la invitación bueno, voy a hablar en inglés, creo, porque es un poco difícil el español ahora, porque hace mucho tiempo que no lo hable y por eso me voy a presentar eso en inglés. Um, so my presentation is titled The Prison Web in Gaza, Carceral Regimes and the Prisoner's Cause. So I will focus mostly on Gaza this time. Um, So, since the 7th of October and the genocide in Gaza, Palestinian prisoners in Israel have suddenly become a widely debated issue. It has been at the core of the negotiations for ceasefires and the release of the hostages. We had three batches of liberation, as you might remember, in November 2023, in February, March 2025, and the last one in October 2025. And their liberation was from the beginning one of the political goals that Hamas announced following the 7th of October. So it even called the wave of liberation Tufan al-Ahrar, the flood of the free. And if you might, of course, remember that the 7th of October attacks were called Tufan al-Aqsa. Can I move? Do you have the next slide? Do you have
No, Professor.
oh,
Perhaps
doesn't move? Oh, why?
perhaps if you try again or if you
Oh, like
yes,
this? Oh,
yes.
okay.
Yes. Thank you.
Okay. So since 1967, the prison experience is widely shared and marks personal and collective stories. Arrest and imprisonment can be the result of armed or violent action, but also of active and lasting party activism, participation in demonstrations, uprisings, clashes, and even social media activism and post. Almost each family has gone through this experience. So if you see these pictures, it might remind you the most recent pictures of Gaza, of the arrest in Gaza, like the same kind of lines of men between 18 and 50 years old that have been arrested in Gaza. So massive prison repression has produced a violence continuum which we find in other situations of settler colonialism. Settler colonial societies are indeed often carceral societies. So mass arrest and incarceration for political reasons have spun what I called a prison web. The prison web is a main control device. So different sources estimate that approximately 40% of the male population since 1967 has been jailed. Women were imprisoned much less often. Between 1% to 3% of the inmates at the same time are women. Oh, yeah, I have to do it like this. So what is the prison web? So this is the book Moses was referring to, which has been published in 2022 in English and 2021 in French. So I define the prison web as a reality of massive arrest and imprisonment, but also as a virtuality. That is to say, a larger legal possibility to detain almost every Palestinian, man and woman, from the OPT from the age of 12. So it is also a suspended detention and uncertainty. The prison web is also the grip of the prison on society due to its massive nature, but also to fractal methods of control reproduced on several scales and in several places, which has in some way merged the inside of the prison and the outside into a shared carceral ethos. So these prisoners are usually called prisoners of war in Palestine, like Asra, or mutakalin siyasiyin, which means political prisoners, but they are depicted as security prisoners, asir bitroni, by the penitentiary administration, the Israel Prison Service. I most often use the broader term political prisoners, which more accurately describes the situation of the majority of them and how they perceive themselves. So since the 7th of October, the number of Palestinian detainees has almost tripled. So beginning of April 2026, we have about 9,560 so-called security prisoners in Israeli prisons, among which 37% are administrative detainees. So administrative detainees that are held without charge and without being tried on the decision of the Israeli intelligence services. So this is a very high percentage, even higher than in the 70s, following the occupation of the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza. So the provisions of administrative detention, as I said, allows holding a person in detention for renewable 6-month periods without charge. The charges are usually kept secret and at the discretion of the intelligence services, the Shabak. It greatly expands the prison web and the temporal boundaries of the prison system, because the purpose of this type of detentions is indeed presented as a way of avoiding any future activity that would threaten security. So the Israeli authorities also hold 1,251 Palestinians as unlawful combatants. So the unlawful combatant law was passed in 2002, and it's the same kind of detention as the administrative detention, but for people belonging to a territory considered as an enemy territory. So
Stephanie, I don't know if you want to show us your slates because we're only seeing the first one.
the first one?
Yes, I suppose you have a more, as you are talking, I suppose your slides are
Yeah.
referring.
So this was the first one. Then I passed to the second one. You saw
Yes,
it. And then I
yes,
am with the third one. You
yes,
see it?
yes.
Okay.
We are okay on that one?
Yeah, yeah. And then I will pass others. But for
Okay,
now,
okay.
this
Thank
is
you,
it.
thank you, thank you.
Okay. Okay. So this data, nowadays we have 342 minors and 84 women who are jailed. This data does not include Palestinians held in military camps, most of whom are Gazans and whose number is unknown. So detention in Israel is not most often a circumscribed moment in the trajectories. Multiplicity of arrests and incarcerations in one's lifetime is another characteristic of this imprisonment. It means that several stays in prison follow one another. But another characteristic of this detention is the harshness of sentences. The percentage of long sentences among those tried and convicted at the end of 2020, for instance, was 40% were serving a sentence of more than 20 years. So the category of the security detainee can be considered as ethno-national one, meaning that only Palestinians, Israeli citizens or not, and Arabs are classified as security detainees. Israeli Jews are not detained under the security prisoner category. So this classification as security prisoner is not a legal provision, but it has major implications on the detention regime of the prisoners. Well, I will not detail all the implications, but let's say that maybe the most important one is that they have almost no possibility of sentence adjustment or remission. And hence, from there, you can understand the centrality of exchange deals. It's the only way to free life and long sentences. However, the recent adoption of a death penalty law for Palestinians last month, convicted of murder of Israelis, and the decision to forbid prisoner exchanger is a major change on that matter. So very harsh conditions have been implemented in prison since the end of 2022 and even more since the 7th of October 2023. So end of 2022 is when Itamar Ben-Gvir became Minister of Internal Security and started to change the condition of detention. So among these different changes in the conditions of detention, you have poor and less access to meals, no access to the canteen to buy items, frequent special units raids and beatings, return to a routine of torture during interrogation and after, no family visits, a policy of solitary confinement for all leaders. And in January 2026, at least 98 prisoners had died in prison since October 7. So this prison web extends post-mortem. So there is a long policy of detentions of corpses. Actually, 778 corpses are detained in morgues and cemetery of numbers, plus around 1,500 in an improvised morgue in the Sthepahnie military camp. So this policy, which is in force since the 60s, let's say, have been intensified since the 7th of October. A lot of Gazans have disappeared and or their bodies have been detained. Moreover, since 2018, a new policy of detaining the bodies of prisoners who died in detention has been implemented primarily for Hamas members, but it has also been extended since October 7. The bodies of the 98 prisoners who died in detention as a result of torture and mistreatment since October 7 have been retained by Israeli authorities. So these policies of mass incarceration benefited greatly from the global legitimacy given by the carceral and punitive turn at work in Western democracies, and in the first instance, American prison policies. So what has been coined by Loïc Vacan, the big carceral government that started in the 80s in the US with the war on drugs. You also have the work of Alice Goffman's On the Run, Fugitive Life in an American City, shows the massification and ethnicization of imprisonment from the 1980s onward, to which were added, to these policies were added after September 11, the fight against terrorism and counterinsurgency measures. That have been another point of legitimation of these massive incarceration policies. So the prison system is one of the key control devices that has been reactivated since the end of the Second Intifada. So between 2000 and 2006. So following the Second Intifada, the main objective of the Israeli authorities has not been to solve a conflict through negotiations, but to manage in the long run a conflict contained at a low intensity level while pursuing the ongoing colonization of the West Bank and Jerusalem. The Israeli authorities have implemented two main types of control mechanism inside the occupied territories and reinforce their presence on both sides of the so-called separation wall. So this projection of control within the West Bank has thickened and multiplied the border. So these devices borrow from contemporary surveillance technologies, which develop in a double movement of confinement, fencing in, and exclusion, fencing out, as described by Zygmunt Bauman and Paul Virilio. So on the one hand, territorial devices have been deployed on the other side of the wall, such as fixed and flying checkpoints and different types of obstacles, watchtowers, earth mounds, trenches, concrete blocks, etc. These obstacles have doubled since October 7. On the other hand, non-territorial structuring and sustainable mechanisms have been enforced, such as the permit system, gradually implemented since 1991. Today, we have more than 100 types of circulation permits, according to the kind of mobility that you are seeking, and the renewal of mass imprisonment policies that have been inaugurated during the first Intifada that turned imprisonment into a population management technique. So these two mechanisms, which feed off each other, are supported by an extensive technological surveillance and intelligence system, which they help to build and nurture. They have produced a vast networks of data enabling the biosocial profiling and risk management required to manage mobility, circulation, and confinement within a discontinuous territory without line borders. So the Palestinian population is thus entirely managed according to a paradigm of dangerousness. Palestinians have different possibilities of mobility, scope of mobility, according to their biosocial profiles that further split the movement. So this draws on the managerial practices of the new penology, which attributes degrees of neutralization and confinement according to a personalized risk evaluation. So the intelligence services, the Shabak, have a significant impact on the penalties and on the mobility of ex-detainees once released from jail. Indeed, it has become the central agency that shaped policy to manage the Palestinian population mainly through its classification on a scale of risks and into categories of security threats according to criteria that consider age, gender, geographic area, family, place of residence, political affiliation, economic status, intelligence, information. I know. I have to, not sure. See. Okay. So judiciary, so punishment is linked to and organizes Palestinian scope of mobility even after their release from jail. So this is a main bordering factor. It has in fact individualized the border, meaning that according to his profile, each one carries his own possibility and scope of movement. So dispersed throughout the territory and within society, the border functions as a data network. And I'm here quoting Popescu on the data network on borders. So to give just an example, of the role given to the penal system in the management of flows and thus in the management of the nation's borders, Palestinians with Israeli citizenships and to a lesser extent Jerusalemites are more heavily punished as enemies from within, and because they can circulate freely in the Israeli and Palestinian spaces and consequently develop broader networks and connections. So for the State of Israel, as citizens or as permanent residents regarding Jerusalemites, they are in general excluded from political negotiations for their release and from prisoner exchange deals. So they are more heavily punished on the one hand, and on the other hand, they are excluded from prisoner exchange deals. So previous works have discussed the increasing carcelization of the West Bank and Gaza through three main devices: prisons, checkpoints, and walls. I'm here referring to the work of Bornstein. So the OPT have thus been described as a carceral society by Bornstein, or as a carceral archipelago by Gregory and Parsons. Others have tackled the impact of territorial control devices on the fragmentation of space and movement, on the mobility and multiplication of the border. I'm here referring to Weizmann. Others have worked on the role of bureaucracy, of documentation, and of the permit system. Parsons and Salter, but also Yael Berda worked a lot on the permit system. Though none of them have focused on military justice practices and mass imprisonment policies per se, in such a context of multi-scholar confinements and production of boundaries. You have works, of course, on military justice and imprisonment, but not connected to this issue of the production of multiple types of boundaries and fragmentation. So, for instance, you have the work of Ismail Nashiv, of Lisa Ajjar on military courts, on Nahla Abdo on women prisoners, and you have a PhD that was defended in 2023 of Basil Faraj on the prisoners, among others. So this system has had a unique impact on Gaza and on Gaza detainees. So I will begin by tracing the establishment from the mid-2000s onward of a specific Gazan prison regime rooted in exceptional penal treatment and a prison management system that also relied on Palestinian political divisions. Then I will analyze the gradual factionalization and politicization of what I call the sacred cause of prisoners. And this within the context of the separation between the two authorities in Ramallah and Gaza and the strengthening of authoritarianism in both places, which led to intra-Palestinian political imprisonments. Finally, I will show how, despite the decrease in the number of Gazan prisoners in Israeli prison from 2005 until the 7th of October, the Hamas government, and more broadly, Hamas and Islamic Jihad, which have established themselves as resistance organizations and whose operational centers are located in Gaza, managed to co-opt this sacred cause, even though these parties were a minority in jails compared to the Fatah prisoners. Indeed, from the Second Intifada until October 7, the proportion of Fatah and Hamas members in prison hardly changed. In fact, the proportion of Fatah prisoners represented half of the political prisoners, and the Hamas prisoners about a quarter of the political prisoners. But of course, since the wave of arrest in the West Bank and in Gaza since October 7, the Hamas prisoners represent, we estimate that they should represent between 30 and 40% of the prison population. So through this organization, Hamas and Islamic Jihad, Hamas and Islamic Jihad have embodied resistance, and through them, Gaza has embodied resistance, but also the struggles for prison rights and the fight for prisoners' release. This embodiment has also been expressed visually with the development of series produced and filmed in Gaza by these factions, Hamas and Islamic Jihad, contributing to what they coined as a resistance cinema. So these are the sources that I've been working on for this book and also for this paper. So during the Second Intifada, the redrawing of territorial boundaries effectively isolated Palestinian areas from one another, enabling their potential sealing off while regulating movement between them. So the Israeli army established what it called territorial cells within the occupied territories, and Gaza constituted one of these cells, as all the movements of goods and people is controlled and restricted. Since Israel's unilateral disengagement from the Gaza Strip in 2005, this territory has become, in their view, an enemy territory, thereby establishing a territorial and military administration that is separate and distinct from that of the West Bank. The split between the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah and the government established by Hamas in Gaza in 2007 has also set the two entities on separate political paths. So, isolated, the Gaza Strip simultaneously regained a territorial unity, till the latest war, of course, that limited military incursions and prevented the regular mass arrests that are and were the norm in the West Bank. Furthermore, in Gaza, at the time of the Second Intifada, Israel had already largely chose bombings and targeted killings of the political and military leaders over incarcerations. So the number of Gazan detainees in Israel has thus fallen sharply since this withdrawal of 2005, as also many former prisoners have completed their sentences. Donc, as of November 6, 2023, there were just over 4% of the Palestinian political prisoners that were from Gaza. Today, as I say, they account for roughly 30 to 40% of the prisoners. So since the genocidal war waged in Gaza, which I describe as a futuricide, we have gradually observed a homogenization of repressive and warlike tactics, as well as of the militarized infrastructural devices deployed in Gaza and the West Bank. They are not identical, of course, but they share comparable features and related aims of colonial annexation across all the occupied territories. So among them, the expansion of the prison web in Gaza is the main characteristic, but rather than an expansion, it's also a return to the prison web in Gaza. So, as I said, thousands of people have been arrested in raids targeting primarily but not exclusively men between the age of 18 and 45. These men were frequently tortured, some were executed, while others disappeared. So it has to be mentioned that in Gaza, it has been mainly, since 2005, it has been mainly during the wars involving incursions that Gazans have been arrested. So the 2008-2009 war, the 2012 war, the 2014 war, and since October 2023. On a more day-to-day basis, Gazans have been arrested at the borders. So either when they were attempting to cross illegally into Israel, or when they were among the few people who obtained a permit to cross into Israel or to travel by crossing legally at the Beit Hanun Erez checkpoint. So these were mainly business people, patients authorized to receive medical treatment in Israel or abroad, and others leaving for studies. So these detentions of permit holders were most often intended to extract information and to exert pressure to recruit collaborators. So the Israeli intelligence services had lacked informants since the 2005 withdrawal, even though the interviews conducted beforehand by the intelligence services with those seeking a permit were already an opportunity to engage in blackmail. Gaza had largely become terra incognita for Israeli intelligence services, whose capabilities in technological espionage were insufficient, while Hamas had developed a relatively secure communication system. However, short-term arrests have proven largely ineffective, as Hamas security forces systematically detain these individuals upon their return for interrogation in order to prevent collaboration. So faced with this uncertainty, some Gazans have completely avoided leaving via Beit Hanun Erez for fear of being suspected by Hamas. So finally, arrests took place in land and maritime borders areas. So the farmers were frequently arrested because their lands were located in these areas close to the border, in the eastern part of the Gaza Strip, close to the barrier surrounding Gaza. Fishermen have also been arrested, either because they were suspected of smuggling or simply because they had crossed border limits, Gaza being enclosed by land, sea, and air. These border limits that shift depending on the situation and which were nevertheless not supposed to be unaware of. So the previous buffer zone, which was about 1 kilometer from the barrier, has now become an Israeli army occupation zone of more than 50% of the eastern part of the Gaza Strip, and it is demarcated by a mobile, so-called yellow line. Mobile because it's moving all the time, and people are, however, supposed to know where it is. Since the Oslo Accords, the Israeli military court in Gaza City had been moved to the border area at Beit Hanun Erez, and the Israeli prison in Gaza was closed. From 2002 onwards, Gazan lawyers were progressively prevented from going there until it was closed in 2005 at the time of Israel's unilateral disengagement. So since then, Gazans have no longer been tried by military justice, as West Bankers do, but have been tried in civil courts and under Israeli criminal law. So in general, they are tried in Beersheba in the south of Israel. So when somebody is arrested at the borders or during military incursions, family in general contact Gaza-based NGOs that have long provided legal assistance to detainees, like the Palestinian Center for Human Rights or Mizan, for instance, or they contact the representative of the Prisoners' Affairs Commission of the Palestinian Authority or the Prisoners' Club, Nadir Asir, so they can connect with a Palestinian Israeli lawyer who can defend them in Israel. So families, of course, are not allowed to attend the hearings. Permits are not issued for this purpose. So in order to prosecute Gazan for security-related offenses, an amendment to the Penal Code was passed by the Knesset in June 2006, allowing specific and harsher provisions to be applied to nationals of this enemy territory. So as I said, shortly before that, in 2002, the law concerning unlawful enemy combatant was passed, and it permits detention without trial. It has no basis in international law, but it was created at the same time when the US created the same category following 9/11. So it was initially intended for Lebanese Hezbollah fighters to be held as bargaining chips and later for Gazans. It was not frequently used until October 2023 for Gazans, but since it has been applied widely to Gazans who have been arrested. So even if starting in 2005, the law applied to Gazans was no longer military law, according to the different lawyers that I interviewed, the sentences and penalties were even harsher in the Beersheba civil court and in the civil courts in general than at the military courts. Indeed, for minor offenses, people are in fact much more heavily charged because in the civil courts and in Beersheba specifically, the judges are not accustomed to deal with so-called security cases and with the daily management of the occupation. Moreover, the military courts are small with few judges working there. As a result, you have many kind of social relations and interaction that have developed among lawyers, judges, and prosecutors, which has facilitated negotiations and a certain degree of understanding. Whereas in Beersheba, everything is more bureaucratic and distant, with judges changing constantly. Yeah, because you have to know that in the military courts, 96, 97% of the cases are solved by plea bargaining. So the issue of negotiation is a main issue. The possibility of arresting Gazans and the judicial system applied to Gazan have changed, and to some extent set Gazan apart following the 2005 disengagements. Furthermore, Palestinian political divisions, followed by the split between Hamas and Fatah, along with the new prison management system gradually implemented by the Israeli prison service in the early 2000s, have weakened the prisoners' movement. I have to change it that way. Okay. So as a shared experience, prison has over time become a major national and citizen experience in Palestine, culminating in the formation in the 1980s from within the men's prison of a political entity, the Palestinian Political Prisoners Movement, Harakat al-Asir al-Falistini, linked to the PLO inside and outside the occupied territories. So this prisoners movement became a true political model that has implemented specific forms of what I call carceral citizenships, a political culture, and what I call also carceral democracy, rooted in the occupied territories and opposed in a certain way to the political practice of the exiled PLO. So the prisoners movement governed time spent in prison and prison struggles, interaction with guards and the prison administration, internal party organization, as well as exchanges between prison branches and parties outside. So, in fact, each party elects an official representative, a leader, for 1 year, who serves on the General National Prison Committee. The majority party then elects for 1 or 2 years the representative of all the prisoners in each prison. This representative has always been a member of Fatah, except during the Oslo Accord periods, when it often reverted to Hamas, which had temporarily become the majority party in jail. Since the Oslo Accords and the establishment of the Palestinian Authority, detainees can also run for Palestinian national elections, whether legislative or presidential. As we saw, as for many examples, I can mention, for instance, Ahmad Saadat, Secretary General of the PFLP, who has been elected MP of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine from prison, or Marwan Barghouti, who intended to run for the presidential election in 2021. This political culture began to weaken with the political divisions surrounding the Oslo Accords and the marginalization of political prisoners who were subordinated to the PLO and the Palestinian Authority, and then even more so with the Second Intifada. So the leadership in detention was confronted with the massive influx of a new generation, some without partisan background, with distinct mentalities and political culture. This was especially true given the fact that few of the old prisoners, of the old party leaders, remained behind bars, especially within Fatah. With the Oslo Agreement, there was the Cairo Agreement, which freed most of the political prisoners. At that time, only 350 prisoners remained in jail. But very quickly, others started to be arrested again. But for a small period, you have just a small number of prisoners inside. Moreover, the leaders of the Second Intifada were victims of Israel policies of targeted killing. Indeed, so soon after, during this Oslo period, members of Hamas mostly and Islamic Jihad, who had been in prison in greater numbers since the first Intifada, were rearrested during these periods as they conducted suicide bombing attacks. Together with the left-wing opposition to the Accords, primarily the PFLP, they constituted what I call the Oslo prison generation. So this explains why the representative of the prison was a Hamas member at that period. Furthermore, the weakening of the political organization inside of the political movement, of the prisoners' movement, was due to the fact that the Second Intifada, contrary to the First Intifada, lacked a unified command structure and program. This breakdown in generational transmission weakened the prisoners' movement, which from 2003-2004 onward faced the implementation of a new prison management system that was directly inspired by Israeli intelligence services. So this system aimed to separate detainees according to their status and their geographical and social affiliations, as well as to individualize daily life behind bars. So the prison administration started to regroup prisoners according to these geographical belongings and to different kind of separation and fragmentation that were not anymore the party organization, because what have been the struggles inside prison have resulted in the fact that the political prisoners could organize themselves and be in the same uh, in the same sections of the prison by political parties. But starting in the beginning of 2000s, the Israeli administration of the prison started to change this. So the movement and communication between the different sections of the prison were prevented, exercise and visiting times were separated, and most party leaders were cut off from the other members of the parties and concentrated in Section 3 of Adarim prison. So to the old game of party division were added distinction based on the geographical origin and types of citizenship of the detainees, modeled on the territorial fragmentation existing in the occupied territories. So this has been widely analyzed by the prisoner Walid Dakar, who died in detention in 2024. He has been writing a lot on these new management policies that started in the 2000s. While Gazan had long been mostly housed in prisons in southern Israel, all detainees were more strictly isolated according to their citizenship and region of residence. So you had Palestinians from Gaza, Palestinians from the West Bank, Palestinian citizens of Israel, Palestinians from Jerusalem, and Syrians from the Golan Heights. Above all, they were further subdivided into distinct sections or cells, like, for instance, city residents were separated from those of the camps they housed. For instance, the Jenin camp was, the people from the Jenin camp were separated from the people from Jenin city, the same with Nablus and Balata camp. And those originating from one city were separated from those coming from another. So with the split between the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank and Hamas in 2007, the prison administration and the intelligence services skillfully institutionalized the divisions between those two groups by bringing together in separate sections the secular parties belonging to the PLO on one side, so Fatah, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, and the Communists, and on the other side, the religious parties outside the PLO, like Hamas and Islamic Jihad, those fueling the division. This occurred even though the partisan leader gathered in the Section 3 of the Adarim prison had, on the contrary, called for national unity by drafting the prisoners' document in 2006 to try to counter the division between Hamas and Fatah, Gaza, and the West Bank outside. So this is a picture from that time when they were all in the Section 3 of the Adarim prison, and at the time when they drafted all together, all the leaders of the different party, different faction, they drafted this prisoners' document. So this document drew upon the shared experience of imprisonment, the common identity of prisoners, and the legitimacy it conferred to present a united front against divisions, exert pressure on the parties outside, and propose a strategic perspective toward Israel. It was indeed the first document endorsed by all influential parties, including the prison branches of Hamas and Islamic Jihad, calling for the establishment of a state in the territories occupied in 1967. So this caused a lot of friction between these parties, between the branches, the prison branches inside jails and these parties outside. Regarding Hamas, it was indeed necessary to wait for the 2017 political document, which serves as a revision of its 1988 charter, for this prospect of a Palestinian state limited to the 1967 borders to be officially endorsed by the party. Moreover, the separation implemented by the Israel Prison Service inside did not align with the existing political fault line between supporters of Oslo and parties opposed to the agreement, like the PFLP and DFLP were hostile to the Oslo Accords, as were Hamas and Islamic Jihad. And also, between those advocating armed resistance and those opposed to this form of struggle. So all these kind of fragmentation, divisions, further weakened the internal organization. With the Second Intifada, this tactical choice deeply divided Fatah itself. The Fatah members who massively returned to Israeli prison during the Second Intifada found a poorly structured party life, especially for Fatah. Fatah was no longer able to unite its prison branch, which lost its capacity to make unified decisions. This contrasted sharply with Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and PFLP militants who had maintained a strong presence in detention and disciplined prison branches. So the overlap of these different types of division has multiplied the fragmentation inside. Over time, by playing on both divisions, on individual emulation and on managerial techniques characteristic of the neoliberal doxa, the prison administration managed to weaken the carceral democracy and prison culture. From this period onward, bans on family visits were applied to groups distinguished according to local, regional, or party criteria. These replicated once again in a fractal logic the fragmentations implemented outside and singled out Gaza as entirely associated with Hamas. The regime of the family visits was progressively governed by a system of privileges shattering the collective. For instance, from 2007 onwards, following Hamas's takeover, Gazan families were collectively deprived of visits on the joint grounds of the capture of the soldier Gilad Shalit in 2006 and, of course, of Hamas takeover of the Gaza Strip. So these visits have been partially re-established following the 2012 prisoners' hunger strikes. So these were the way the family visits were done previously by the ICRC. The ICRC was in charge of organizing them. In 2018, visits were once again prohibited for Hamas detainees on the grounds of the lack of visiting rights for the 2 Israeli nationals held in Gaza and the stalled negotiation for a prisoner exchange. So starting from that time, for security detainees, visits have been officially permitted every 2 months, with the prison administration reserving the right to grant them more frequently to certain individuals or groups. Since 7 of October, family visits have been again prohibited for everyone. So this was in addition to a series of repressive measures initiated since the arrival of the far-right Jewish supremacist Itamar Ben-Gvir and Minister of Internal Security in late 2022, as I already mentioned. So as I said, it includes solitary confinement of all leaders, massive torture practices in the prison of the Israeli Prison Service, and even more so in the military camps that have been opened after October 7. Marouane Barghouti, like all the leaders, has been in solitary confinement since October 7, in Megiddo prison most of the time, and now in Ganot prison. He hardly can see his lawyer. Because of his popularity and the political alternative he represents in Palestine, he has been attacked and heavily beaten various times by guards in his cell, including with dogs, and denied medical treatment. His health condition is not good and his life is seriously at stake. So the very harsh conditions that have been imposed on prisoners since the end of 2022, and even more since October 2023, have highly impacted, and for the time being almost crushed, the prisoners' movement and the political organization in detention. So since then we have witnessed there has been a multiplication of detention sites, essentially military, whereas Palestinian detainees were previously held since a while, not since 1967, but since a while, mostly by the Civil Prison Administration. So now you have various camps that you, of course, have heard of, like Sthepahnie in southern Israel, which is the mostly known for the torture that has been going on there. But you have also many other smaller military detention centers that have been set up in the south of Israel and near Jerusalem, like the one in Anatot. And you have a whole new carceral geography that has been implemented. And some of these centers have long remained or still remain unknown, in fact. You have a whole process, and so these centers some of them are unknown, so you have a whole process of enforced disappearances. And a new carceral and exception geography, which is largely outside any legal framework. The militarization of prison and the intensification of incarceration are also due to total isolation and the near total closure of detention facilities, whether civil or military. In addition to family visits that are forbidden, lawyer visits were completely prevented for 8 months, and then for 8 months starting 7/11, and then drastically reduced. Similarly, the ICRC that has always had access to the prisoners have been barred from visiting both military centers and prison. This was a visit previous, of course, to the 7/11 of the ICRC of Ramon prison in the south. This is another view of Ramon prison. So this isolation has also been created by the confiscation, of course, of all mobile phones that have entered in detention. Since another hunger strike, political prisoners were supposed to have access to phones since May 2019, but it was very poorly implemented. And of course, it has been completely forbidden since 7 of October. So no information is provided to family. The ICRC or the Israeli NGO Amoked, which previously maintained relatively smooth communication with the prison service and was responsible for locating detainees for families, also do not have any information on the detainees. And many, different Israeli NGOs, such as Amoked, B'Tselem, Physicians for Human Rights, refer to military camps as torture centers. So while torture was less prevalent previously, from 1999 onwards, before it has been prevalent, it was specifically focused during the time of interrogation. But since 7 of October, it has been, you had torture practices during interrogation, but also during periods of detention by guards and soldiers in military camps and also in civil prisons. In the summer of 2007, the rift between Hamas and Fatah further resulted in a wave of intra-Palestinian arrests, about 1,000 people on both sides. These detainees were then most often classified as security prisoners, also the same kind of labeling as Israeli labeling. So in Arabic, it will be amniyin. At that time, the two rival authorities engaged in open conflict acknowledged detaining members of the opposing party for political reasons, thereby establishing a kind of balance of power and a bargaining chips. So they have been incarcerated in the Jericho prison and the detention center of the Palestinian Authority security services, the different security services, the general intelligence, the preventive security, the military intelligence. Each of those has its own centers, its own center for imprisonment. Since then, the number of Hamas and Fatah members detained has fluctuated depending on the state of tension between the governments of Ramallah and Gaza, following a kind of policy of reciprocity. So these political imprisonments were imprisonment exclusively of men, but they decreased from 2011, 2012 to between 50 to 100 people in both places. In the West Bank in 2007, the restored security cooperation between Israeli authorities and Palestinian security forces involved the disarmament of all armed resistant militias, the arrest of suspects belonging to this group and to opposing parties, especially Hamas and Islamic Jihad, and the sharing of information between their services. Furthermore, as the authoritarian drift of the PA has increased, arrests have aimed to regulate the political game in order to ensure the predominance of the Hamas trend of the Fatah movement in power. Internal detention or security cooperation are thus used to curb the influence of other movements, particularly during the elections of student council, for instance, of professional unions also, and local councils union, which are ongoing right now, are starting in a short while. The only election that have been held regularly, and where the Islamic bloc often holds the majority. So activists from Islamic movements, but also from left-wing parties like the FPLP, the PFLP, first of all, but also the DFLP and the People's Party, but also people engaged in popular resistance or in BDS, and those belonging to competing groups within Fatah, such as, for instance, the supporters of Mohammed Dahlan or of Marwan Barghouti, are targeted by arrest by the PH services to intimidate them, as we have seen, for instance, during the electoral campaign in May 2021, which was supposed to lead to legislative elections and then presidential election that have been cancelled at the last minute by President Abbas. So public freedom have been reduced, and security cooperation, which is criticized by more than 80% of the population, also took an internal function, since it constituted a lever to control the opposition, to control politics and society in the West Bank, by transmitting the appropriate information to their Israeli counterparts, and sometimes deliberately playing on the tension in one or the other system, or in one then in the other. Most of the people released from Israeli prison after administrative detention or for membership in a party other than Fatah are often rearrested by the Palestinian security forces and sometimes convicted for the same offenses or vice versa, thus creating a back and forth pattern, which is called the revolving door, al-bab al-dawar. And sometimes they are even arrested by different intelligence services of the PA. In Gaza, the severe repression of opponents has not intensified since the early years of Hamas takeover in 2007. At a time when there were mass arrests of Fatah members and widespread torture. Rather, it has fluctuated depending on wars and depending on Hamas' ability to ensure a decent life for Gazans. Periods of relative internal openness occurred when Hamas needed to consolidate power undermined by the economic situation, particularly during the few years following the end of the tunnel economy after 2013. So in Gaza, in addition to Fatah members that are arrested, according to the relation with Ramallah and the arrest by the PA, others are arrested because on charge of spying on behalf of the PA or on behalf of Israel or on behalf of international interest or collaboration with the occupation. And they are detained in internal security and military police centers. Interrogation are brutal and detainees tortured also. So specific opponents were also targeted in Gaza, such as the Salafists. The Salafists have been widely imprisoned in Gaza by Hamas because of different reasons I will not detail here. But also you have a lot of arrests of journalists, bloggers, activists, or ordinary protesters for crimes of opinion. These kind of arrests are common in Gaza. There are often ways to intimidate, to prevent critical speech and street protest. Individuals were usually released shortly after, but you have frequently pressure exerted on them and on their family to avoid opposition inside Gaza, for people to accept the limits of political speech or leave Gaza. So the protest and the demonstration denouncing poor living condition, shortages in Gaza, or the wage cuts have become very frequent since 2015. So you had many protests like the We Want to Leave movement, Badna Naish, We Want Electricity movement, Batna Karaba, etc. So these broader protests are less tolerated than political criticism from political parties. Okay, last. In Gaza, it is less the continuity between two repressive systems, but rather this isolation and state of siege imposed by the Israeli authorities, as well as the rift with the PA, that have increased the length and the harshness of time spent behind bars for everyone. So the judicial backlog has been all the more massive because since the split, the majority of judges have been ordered to stay home by the PA in Ramallah, while the Hamas administration was unable to train judges, struggled to recruit judges, and to pay them. So you had a situation where you had judges paid by the PA staying at home and a lack of judges. So moreover, for several years, from 2007 till 2013, defendants were even more poorly represented because all the civil society organizations that provided lawyers for those unable to afford private counsel boycotted the courts in protest against Hamas' seizure of power. This backlog resulted in prison overcrowding, particularly in the police and internal security centers. Oh, I'm sorry, this is written in French, but this is the visit of the central prison of Gaza, so under Hamas government. So you can see that. So prison staff are drawn from the police force, so they receive virtually no training, and their salaries are meager when they are paid at all. After Hamas seized power, only 40% of the police remained in their post, and despite hasty recruitment efforts, staffing levels remain low, particularly in the prison system. So before October 7, most of the 5 existing prisons in Gaza were not designed to be prisons. And the renovation or the construction of new facilities was hampered by the Hamas government's perpetual financial crisis, largely due to the priority given to military spending and the lack of donors, as apart from the Qatari government, nobody wanted to invest in prisons in Gaza, at the international level, I mean. So shortages were rampant in the prisons, which were neglected, and disreputable spaces where families had to provide food, blankets, and medicine to ensure a semblance of normalcy in jails. So prisoners were subjected to even greater mistreatment during periods of conflict. So police stations, internal security headquarters, interrogation centers, and prisons were systematically targeted by the Israeli army during the wars, and of course, again, since October 7. because they were and they are considered as military targets. So they were given priority for destruction, endangering detainees and exacerbating overcrowding in places that remained. So, as I said, inadequate facilities intended for other users were hastily converted into prisons. So, for instance, I will not give you all the details, but Khatibeh prison was a sports center. And in the different wars, detention facilities have been destroyed, including the Gaza Central Prison, Saraya, that was destroyed in 2008, 2009, and then again in 2012. And of course, now they all have been destroyed. So during the conflicts, the least dangerous prisoners were allowed to return home for the duration of the hostilities. Common criminals convicted of more serious crimes were hidden, and those held for acts of collaboration were sometimes executed. So in Gaza, the state of war and the threat to places of detention precipitate a dangerous spiral in the decision and then in the execution of the death penalty, which remains in force and is applied in Gaza, contrary to the West Bank. So the prisoners' cause was constituted as a sacred cause, a major support for a unified discourse. But it has been strongly tainted by intra-Palestinian incarceration. And it is also the subject of a concealed competition to represent it. So the PA, through its Ministry of Prisoners, which became after, in 2014, a commission of prisoners under the PLO, has invested in increased financial support for all prisoners and former prisoners. So it consists of many different things, like a monthly allowance that varies according to the length of time spent in prison, also various kind of social helps for the family, for the children, and post-detention rehabilitation, how do you say, post-detention rehabilitation schemes. But this financial support that has been given by the PA and then the PLO has been highly attacked by the Israeli authorities and the US authorities since a while. And these subsidies that have been maintained despite this very aggressive Israeli campaign against the PA for a decade, which was accused of supporting terrorism, and it was strongly supported by the first Trump administration presidency, were finally restricted in 2025 following intensified pressure. So that at the end, they changed the way this financial support functions, turning it from a support to prisoners according to the time spent in prison to a support to prisoners according to social situations. So this has been highly criticized in the Palestinian society. In Gaza, the PA Commission has continued its services and assistance to Gaza detainees in prison in Israel, because the Hamas-run ministry having virtually no funds. But little by little, with the split, the continued provision of assistance to all detainees stopped at the prison gates and did not extend to the post-detention support system, contrary to legal provision, because there is a law that has been passed in 2004 for this issue of financial support to the prisoner. So a case-by-case approach began to prevail. So, of course, post-incarceration financial aid was not intended for active Hamas members, but until 2018, they received, like everyone else, a monthly allowance as well as the amount allocated for canteen meals. Then, well, I will not go into details because I've been speaking for a while and I still have some different things to say. The escalation of tension between Hamas and Fatah and the PA's use of financial sanction against the Gaza government in early 2018 to force it to accept its reassertion of control over Gaza led to the temporary suspension of allowances and canteen services for Gazan. So these measures have represented a complete break with the national policy previously pursued toward all political prisoners and with the shared perception of the prisoners' cause as sacred. So there's a huge disapproval that has grown regarding the factionalization of the prison of the prison cause and all the prison related assistance and the increase in inequalities in treatment among prisoners, at least till 7th of October, because as I said, because the focus that Hamas has put on the liberation of the prisoners has shifted, in a way, the perception of Palestinian society, or at least part of Palestinian society, of the centrality of the prison cause, because they said, oh, Gaza has been destroyed for the prisoners, and so it started to be contested. It started to be contested as a unitary cause, though it was something really major previously. So the factionalization of the prisoners' cause has become an institutional reality implemented by Mahmoud Abbas' PA, despite, at a point, widespread protest, including from within its own ranks. So this was. So you had also a major critique concerning the marginalization of former prisoners that have been excluded from the true decision-making circles within the PA, the PLO, and Fatah, and the PA's lack of progress on the issue of releases of prisoners. So prisoners are now treated mostly by the PA in terms of social or humanitarian problems. Hamas, however, secured the release of 1,027 political prisoners in exchange for the soldier Shalit in 2011. So Israeli authorities negotiated indirectly with the Hamas leadership through Egyptian intelligence, which acted as the official intermediary in this negotiation. But the Israeli authorities did not really negotiate or allow to liberate prisoners through negotiation with the PA. So it's only Hamas who managed to liberate a certain number, a consequent number of prisoners. They also negotiated directly with Hamas leaders in prison, such as Abbas Sayed, that we saw in the picture, Mohammed Erman, Yahya Sinwar. And Sinwar have been, in fact, released in 2011 in the so-called Shalit deal, and became, as everybody knows, Hamas leaders in Gaza from 2017 until his death in October 2024. So the Shalit exchange, which Hamas called the Wafa al-Ahrar exchange, which could be translated as the loyalty of free men, is one of many large-scale exchanges for captured Israeli soldiers, dead or alive, and occurred a month after the Palestinian Authority submitted its application for recognition of Palestine as a state to the UN. So it overshadowed completely the PA's internationalization strategy and highlighted once again the impasse of the Oslo Accords diplomatic mechanism. Hamas gave this exchange a national dimension, positioning itself, starting from that moment, as the true representative of the prisoners, and therefore as the sole representative of the national cause. Hamas has once again found itself in the position of negotiator and liberator since 2014 Gaza war. In fact, at that time, he was holding at least 2 soldiers captured during the 2014 war that were declared dead by the Israeli army, and 2 Israeli civilians. That this position has been, of course, reinforced since the abduction of 252 hostages, the vast majority of them Israelis, on October 7. So it obtained, during the three batches of exchanges, it obtained the liberation of a great deal of prisoners, and these releases included many long-term prisoners and even some sentenced to life imprisonments, as well as several prominent figures in the prison system, but it failed to secure the release of leaders it has considered priorities since 2011 and placed at the top of its list, like Marwan Barghouti, for instance, who is a member of the Fatah Central Committee, Ahmed Saadat, as I mentioned before, and Hamas political and military figures such as Ibrahim Ahmed, Abdullah al-Barghouti, Hassan Salame, Habas al-Sayed, who remain incarcerated. Plus, it has to be noted that since October 7 until now, the number of prisoners have been multiplied by 3. So it has freed prisoners, but many, many more were arrested. So in terms of, as a strategy, it cannot be considered as a success. But it has to be mentioned that more broadly, since 2012 and the hunger strikes of dignity, the first hunger strike led by Hamas, the opposition front to the PA drew upon the political experiences and realities of prison life. If we talk about Marwan Barghouti, who is the more popular politician, opinion polls have long predicted his victory in a potential presidential election. He is recognized for many by Palestinian society, and it has a wide popularity. And he also had very good relation with all faction leaders and also with Hamas and Islamic Jihad leaders. It's one of the reasons why he was put on the top list of the leaders that Hamas wanted to liberate. And why? Because he wrote the prisoners' documents with some of the leaders of Hamas and Islamic Jihad. He lived in Adarim with their leaders, and notably with Yahya Sinwar and Abbas al-Sayed, and is respected by his former fellow prisoners and seen as the most capable of uniting and smoothing over the division between Hamas and Fatah to achieve institutional reunification between the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And he has also very good relation with the PFLP. And as you might know, the Fatah trend of Hamas has not good relation with the PFLP. So he's like a unitary figure among different parties, but in opposition to the Mahmoud Abbas trend of the Fatah. So many Hamas officials trust him and believe he could be a political alternative that would foster national reconciliation and could change the political landscape in Palestine. For this reason, his life is at stake because the Israeli authorities do not want to have a political alternative in Palestine. Barghouti publicly opposed Mahmoud Abbas during the failed legislative elections that were scheduled for May 2021 by supporting one of the two Fatah dissident lists, the one headed by Nasser al-Qidwa, Yasser Arafat's nephew, and longtime PA ambassador to the UN, on which his wife was second on the list, and when he announced he would run from his prison cell in the presidential election scheduled for July 2021. This outright opposition of a Fatah leader such as Barghouti, combined with that of Hamas, was the main reason that led to the postponement of the electoral process, supposed to be renewed this year, but we'll see. His recent rapprochement with Mohammed Dahlan, another Fatah dissident expelled from the Fatah party in 2011, who also ran a list in 2021 parliamentary election, along with the return of Dahlan supporters to Gaza following a reconciliation with Hamas, has shaped a growing opposition to the Palestinian Authority and the Abbas faction within Hamas. Furthermore, during the 2022 municipal election, local council election held in the West Bank but not in Gaza, Hamas having officially boycotted the vote at that time, he forged successful electoral alliances by fielding independent candidates and partnering with the Popular Front of the Liberation of Palestine in 25 West Bank cities and towns. I'm talking about Hamas. He also secured alliances during the professional union elections based on shared position regarding the necessity of all forms of resistance and opposition to PA policies, particularly security cooperation. Similarly, the Islamic parties based in Gaza, Hamas and Islamic Jihad, benefited from the votes of left-wing parties opposed to the PA's policies and primarily from the PFLP, and during the 2022 student elections, which notably allowed them to win those at Birzeit University. So before October 7, buoyed by its electoral successes in the West Bank, its achievements in securing prisoner releases and its ability to obtain further releases, its military exploit and its support for an armed resistance that grew in size and became organized primarily locally and organically in the northern West Bank, Hamas, and with it Islamic Jihad, projected the image of the Gaza Strip as a real base and the embodiment of resistance to the occupation. Even though they remained a minority in prison compared to Fatah, and even though the resistance struggles and prison victories were not always directly their doing and only marginally affected Gaza, they intended both to place Gaza at the center and to fully capture the major militant resource represented by the sacred cause of the prisoners. So the production in recent years in Gaza of what Hamas and Islamic Jihad channels called resistance cinema has significantly contributed to constructing and projecting this image. The state releases of hostages and prisoners following the January 2025 ceasefire agreement were a continuation of this communication strategy and Hamas' particular focus on the performative dimension of images. So this resistance cinema firmly anchored its representation on the one hand in the prison ethos, in the prison identity, and on the other hand in Gaza, the backdrop of all action, even when the plot did not take place there. Hamas thus produced and broadcast the series called Kabdat al-Ahrar, which could be literally translated as the Feast of the Freed, in 2022, the title of which refers to the released prisoners. These series present a fictionalized account of various acts of resistance, notably that of Hamas militants during an Israeli operation in Gaza in 2018. And in retrospect, the series was perceived as prescient or as a deliberate projection of future action intended to blur the line between fiction and reality. Because in the series, an attack that thwarted the Israeli army, which looked like very closely to the one of October 7, was depicted in the series. The Islamic Jihad channel, which is called Al-Quds Al-Yom, for its part, produced two series directly focused on prisoners' bravery against the prison system through the dramatization of two anthology escapes. So Milad al-Fajr, The Birth of Dawn, broadcasted during Ramadan 2021, recounted the 1987 Gaza prison escape. And in 2022, the series called Shara al-Nas Gilboa, which could be translated as badge or symbol of victory, Gilboa, which is the name of a prison, tells in 25 episodes the epic story of the escape of the 6 Jenin prisoners in September 2029 from the high-security Gilboa prison located in northern Israel through a tunnel dug using spoons and other small utensils, thus thwarting the Israeli security. So these productions have been broadcasted during Ramadan and are based on real events, and are initially aimed to galvanize viewers by creating epic scenarios that brought a sense of possibility through the fictionalization of past or future realities. They also sought to rival Israeli series, particularly Fauda. Their production, of course, and distribution channels are radically different, limited to local or Arab channels politically aligned with Hamas or Jihad, or to the internet. And the resources available for the production are also very different. Yet, this series, filmed entirely in Gaza, present images with a striking overall aesthetic, technically very accomplished and supported by 3D reconstruction, for example, in the scene of Sharat al-Nas Gilboa, where we see the Gilboa prison from the outside. So symbolized, as you might remember, by the spoon, which spread across social media and social networks and the press, this escape in 2021 sparked a wave of huge solidarity, hope, and joy in Palestine throughout the time that they were out, about 2 weeks. During their time on the run, they attempted to reach Jenin, with only two succeeding before being arrested. Hamas immediately sought to politically capitalize on the emotion generated by this escape, which was experienced and followed as an epic adventure. On this occasion, Hamas asserted its position as the prisoners' representative, declaring that any exchange agreement with the Israeli authorities must necessarily include these 6 detainees, 3 of whom have been included in the last exchange. In fact, the last exchange that occurred in Gaza since the 7th of October. In doing so, it politically and symbolically linked them to Gaza, the embodiment of a victorious resistance. It is also this image of Gaza that the Shara al-Nasr Gilboa series hammers home and projects. It retraces the year it took them to dig this tunnel and tells an idealized existence in detention and idealized values of the prisoners, giving its vision of resistance and attachment to the land of Palestine, particularly at the time when the prisoner that have escaped cross Israeli territory, hiding and feeding themselves in the orchard. So all these prisoners were from Jenin, but Hamas just captured the whole issue and reattached, the history of this escape to Gaza. Furthermore, although Jenin was, as I said, the geographical and nerve center of this event, the series constantly emphasizes that the resistance rear base is Gaza and that the escapees can rely on it. They are not alone. Thus, in several scenes after their capture, the escapees defy the intelligence service interrogators by telling them that they are supported by the Gazan resistance, which warn the Israeli authorities if anything happened to them, and that they do not fear further punishment since they will be released thanks to the future exchange that Hamas will obtain, which was partially true as 3 of them were freed. So I will conclude saying that while prisoners from Gaza remained a minority until October 7, Gazans have been systematically subjected to post-mortem detentions, which have increased significantly since October 2023. The entire Gazan population has thus long been associated with Hamas, and not only since October 7. Even before the war that began in October 2023, which placed Gaza, Hamas, Izzeddin al-Qassam brigades, and Islamic Jihad al-Quds brigades at the center of the national struggle, this party constantly sought to capture the entire militant and popular resources represented by the sacred cause of the prisoners and to embody the resistance from Gaza. They have continued to constitute themselves materially, politically, and symbolically as its rear base, notably using the performative dimension of images, even though, until October 7, the geographies of non-violent popular resistance on the one hand and armed resistance on the other had partly shifted to the West Bank and particularly to the north. And these movements and groups uh, that have been created in the north intended to break free from the control of partisan apparatuses. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor. Thank you very much to you for this wonderful, deep, fine, and amazing work that you have done during all of these years. And I can see now that you have extended your work from the West Bank to what's happened right now in Gaza, and you are following the facts, the exchange, the facts of violence by Israel, not only in Jenin, Nablus, Qalqilia, and other places of the West Bank, but now also you have done it in Gaza with this very new and very important issue for the people who are following what's happening with the prisoners inside prisons and outside prisons. I mean, after the detention. If you allow me, I will speak in Spanish because I want to know if some of the audience have one question or any other comment because we have a few time, we have few minutes before the session is over. However, I would like to ask for audience if they have some questions. But please allow me to speak in Spanish, Professor Sthepahnie. Even you understand Spanish, so I don't worry about it. Bueno, ha sido un trabajo fenomenal, ha sido un trabajo muy profundo, como le decía yo a la doctora Millán. Elabora no solamente trabajos sobre la forma en la que trabaja la red de detención autoritaria del Estado de Israel, sino también cómo trabaja dentro de las prisiones, separando prisioneros de Jenin, de Calquilia y ahora de Gaza, donde la profesora Sthepahnie dice que desde el 2023, cuando antes la proporción era más o menos del 50% de los detenidos era de Al-Fatah, la facción contraria de Hamas en la cuestión palestina. Después del 7 de octubre, ahora los detenidos de Hamas son alrededor del 48%, por obvias razones. También se trabaja, por si alguien se perdió en el hilo, un poco sobre la cuestión de la causa de los prisioneros como una causa sagrada. Eso es lo que dice la profesora, una causa sagrada en el entendido de que los prisioneros son la causa política más importante de todos los palestinos y palestinas, sin importar dónde vivan, dentro o fuera de Cisjordania o incluso dentro y fuera de Palestina, y es lo que une a todos los palestinos y palestinas alrededor de la cuestión, solo por detrás incluso de la independencia del Estado palestino, probablemente. Ella habla de un archipiélago carceral o de un sistema carceral, digamos, fragmentado, donde no solamente Israel trabaja dentro de las prisiones, sino que también sigue a las personas que son liberadas y que al momento de seguirlas, pues también extraen información de carácter personal, afiliación política, incluso en algún momento se les negocia incluso su liberación si ellos quieren convertirse en colaboradores del Estado de Israel. Entonces, es un trabajo en donde ella también aborda las fronteras de manera móvil que hay a lo largo de los territorios ocupados y también la forma en la que el Estado de Israel ha debilitado al movimiento político de los prisioneros que trabajan dentro de las prisiones palestinas, particularmente las prisiones que mencionó en la presentación. La de Ramón fue donde se detuvieron, por ejemplo, a los colegas de la flotilla que fueron detenidos una vez que llegaron. La prisión de Ramón fue muy famosa en los medios y entre las figuras que ella mencionó estaban en las fotografías Marwan Burguti, Ahmed Sadat, Hassan Salami, entre otras personas. También estaba ahí Yahya Sinwar, que fue producto de un intercambio de prisioneros y que al salir de la prisión se convirtió en uno de los líderes más importantes de Hamas en Gaza, cuyo desenlace ya pudimos ver. Colegas, este es más o menos un resumen que me comprometí a hacer con la doctora Margarita Millán, pero evidentemente no es ni el 1% de lo que pasó a lo largo de esta hora y media. Y quisiera preguntarles si ustedes tienen alguna pregunta. Yo tengo una, pero me la voy a reservar porque quiero ver si ustedes quieren aprovechar estos minutitos que tenemos. Doctora Millán, colegas.
Hay una...
Sí, bueno, en primer lugar, darle muchas gracias a Stephanie por este excelente trabajo. Le decía yo a Moisés que ojalá tengamos pronto la traducción de tu libro, Stephanie, en español. Y gracias también por el terrible trabajo de pasar del francés al inglés y al español, ¿no? O sea, toda esta traducción. Em, Tú dijiste en algún momento que decías que el genocidio, eso entendí, era futuricidio. Creo que eso dijiste. A mí me gustaría mucho
Mm.
que profundizaras en esa noción. Eh, y bueno, yo creo que esto lo tenemos que rumiar, es muchísima información. Es increíble también pensar cómo los prisioneros están prisioneros, pero no están eh, desconectados del movimiento, cómo se han logrado organizar, todo lo que nos relataste. Es un mundo, ¿no? Ese de la prisión, esta idea de una frontera pues totalmente porosa, impredecible, ¿no? Eh, Quizá también vincular pues toda esta idea de la red carcelaria con otros lugares en América Latina, en Estados Unidos mismo, pero bueno, por ejemplo, tenemos El Salvador ahora con esos centros de prisión impactantes, ¿no? Donde también no es necesario tener un motivo para que te tomen y te emprisionen, ¿no? Pero lo que es muy interesante es todo este trabajo que tú has hecho de cómo se han ido organizando adentro de las prisiones y el cambio generacional y también lo que haces al final. Y ahí sí yo quisiera también saber tu opinión sobre cómo jamás, de alguna manera, y creo que esto sí es algo que hay que señalar, captura todas las resistencias que son múltiples y que son muy diversas dentro del horizonte del pueblo palestino, ¿no? Eh, Pues preguntarte cómo podemos ver esas series que tú mencionaste y que son lo que constituye esto que también dices de la resistencia en el cine, ¿no? O en las imágenes, o sea, cómo también de repente jamás parecería ser la única fuerza política que está ahí, cuando en realidad pues hay muchas vertientes y que es difícil lograr esa unidad, ¿no? Y bueno, como señalas lo que muchos y muchas ya entendimos de la figura de Burguti y la importancia de que él permanezca vivo y que ojalá salga, ¿no? Y, y bueno, lo último quizá, pues la aprobación de la ley del exterminio, de la ejecución de los prisioneros que está ahí pendiente, ¿no? La soga frente a todos los que están hoy en prisión como algo, pues que, no sé, que va a suceder, que es posible, pues que ya está la ley, ¿no? Como para que esto suceda, que es un escenario terrible. Eso. Y muchísimas gracias, Estefan.
Muchas gracias para todas esas preguntas y comentarios. Voy a contestar en inglés. Um, He visto también que hay una pregunta en el chat, probablemente.
Sí.
Okay. In fact, mm, so what I said and what I elaborated was really the whole period before 7th of October. Okay, I followed after 7th of October, but let's say that concerning Hamas and the prisoners, um, I mean, now many people are saying have a different way of considering the prisoners. It was a sacred cause, and it is still a sacred cause in a way because every family has been concerned or is concerned, has somebody in jail or has had somebody in jail. But the fact that Hamas put a lot of its um, its communication and its energy to say we want to liberate prisoners, and for this we are resisting, and the result, which is a strategic failure in a way, because Gaza is completely destroyed, has impacted the way some people perceive the prisoners' cause. Like I say, okay, you did all this for the prisoners. We don't want to hear so much of the prisoners. So it has a bit changed the way it has been perceived previously. But it has to be seen later how it will develop. But it's clear that the result that Gaza is completely destroyed has changed the fact. And it's the same for Hamas. Like it managed to capture the whole resistance, the whole idea of resistance for a long time, though you always had also non-violent resistance, which is also quite strong in the West Bank. But lately, the idea of armed resistance, let's say starting in 2021, was rising again, let's say, with all the small groups in the West Bank. And so, but now, with what happened, it's also changing, and especially in Gaza. Like in Gaza, has a very low popularity in the different polls that we can see. And armed resistance also is not like something which is very popular. So, of course, it's very different when you go to the West Bank, when you go to the diaspora, because when people are not directly concerned, they will more rely to an idea of resistance brought about by Hamas. But when you are now in destroyed Gaza, and that you have been also submitted before to the fact that the Hamas government is very authoritarian, like the PA, but you don't have the same perspective on Hamas and on resistance and on armed resistance specifically. So I think this still has to be seen, but it's something. As you said, I really worked mostly, I couldn't mention it here because, I already spoke too long, on this issue of porosity between inside and outside prison, porosidad, I don't know in Spanish. So I worked on the issue of porosity concerning political careers and political mobilization, but also on porosity in personal lives and the way to maintain a life when you are condemned to life sentences, and how you can avoid, like say, social death by for whole for a major part of the population. If you consider that since 67, 40% of the male population has gone to jail. Of course, people have managed to mobilize and to have different ways to have clandestine practices to maintain political organization and social life beyond bars, But since 7th of October, and even since the end of 2022, with the very, very repressive measures that have been put forward by this Benvir, this is in a this is almost crushed. I don't know how it would be reconstructed and rebuilt, but it has been widely crushed, now. As Gaza has been crushed, we are in a situation of massive erasure, and also in Lebanon, South Lebanon, which is something that is, for that, I coined, not in this book, but we just published a book called Gaza, a Colonial War, which is a collective book that's been published in France in June 2025. And I coined this notion of futuricidio, to try to first to describe the different kind of sides that have been going on, like genocide, ecocide, scholasticide, scholasticide, epistemicide, we have, and urbicide, all these sides that have been going on, but also to try to think in a temporal way, because it's not just something, it's not just an erasure in the present time. It's an erasure that uh, build wants to erase also the past with the memory side, with the way many of the monuments have been destroyed, but also the cemeteries have been destroyed. Half of the cemeteries of Gaza, for instance, which is the way that you relate to a place, the way you relate to your ancestors, to your family and stuff. So this is a way to also erase the memory, the way also it has been the memories of places have been transformed. There is a Palestinian journalist from Gaza, Rami Abu Jamous, who has wrote about that, saying that it changes completely the memories you have from place. For instance, in Gaza, the sea was a place of leisure, a nice place, and then people have been pushed at a point on the sea in refugee makeshift tents and this. So the way the way they perceive the beach has completely changes. The way they perceive the churches or the mosque have changed because it's a place also where they were crowded as refugees. So it says that it's also done to make you hate Gaza by the fact that you will relate to places with a very traumatic memories. So there is this thing, and also the temporal dimension is the future, like the way they have systematically targeted what makes possible a life in the future, meaning the universities. All universities buildings have been destroyed, 63. The health system has been widely destroyed. The university professors, the doctors have been targeted, the journalists. So also what also allows you to construct in the future has been targeted. Plus the fact that when you are put in such a radical uncertainty situation, you anticipate the future, you anticipate what you can do. You don't know what the future will be. So you will anticipate, you will say, no, I will not go there, I will not do that, because maybe it will be dangerous to do this and to do that. So it's a way to governmentalize the future and the way you behave and your projection. And lastly, the whole plans that we have been seeing on the future of Gaza, I mean, the one that have been promoted by the Israelis and the Americans, the Gaza 2035, the plan, the peace plan of Trump, and many others that have been developed along these years, are projecting a future of Gaza without Gazans in a way, just, Gazans with a kind of small administrative role or put in humanitarian cities. So this is also like occupying the mind and the imagination of a future, like a colonial futurity, like it has been said by. So this is also a way to act on the future of the people in Gaza. For that, I'm talking of futuricides, because the objective, in fact, is to destroy the whole scope and the whole scope of time also, and the way you can project yourself. Of course, there are other projections. There is a plan made by the Gazan municipalities and other Palestinian, which is called the Phoenix Plan, which is completely different of the American and Israeli plans. Of course, people in Gaza do not believe in these plans that are completely out of the blue, and with the Riviera and all these things that have been pushed forward. But still, these people, they monopolize a kind of global conversation on the future of Gaza. And so this notion of futuricide is not to say that it will work like that, but it's an intention of futuricide, a real intention of futuricide. So this was what I coined with this word of futuricide, that I thought it's describing also what is going on. Yeah, on the issue of Barghouti, for me, I think that they really want to kill him in jail, to be honest, because he is a political alternative. He's committed to peace with Israelis in the sense like a just peace, a just political negotiation. He can unite behind him all the factions, so he can really make a difference. But they do not want so because they do not want their whole strategy. I mean, of this government at least, is not is to avoid politics, political negotiation, etc., and to not consider Palestinian as political, um, I'd say, partners. But to deal with Palestine and with Gaza, it started after the Second Intifada when they started to manage the conflict. But now they want to do it with logistic, uh, with biometric surveillance, with all these kinds of algorithmic way of dealing with people, with security apparatus and all this AI stuff and stuff. So they don't want to deal it politically. They want to deal it like as a logistic issue. So they don't want somebody as Barghouti. They do not want him. And I hope he will not uh, be killed, little by little, because now it's what they are doing. They are just beating him from time to time, preventing access to medical care. He's not so young, they are just doing it that way. And then the death penalty, the law that has been, in the Israeli law, death penalty is there, but it has many things that made the fact that it was not implemented, that could not be implemented. It has been implemented for Eichmann, so the only possibility was for Nazi criminals, So it has been implemented once, no, twice, I think 2 or 3 times for Nazi criminals, but then it was not possible to have the death penalty. But they passed this law now, which make it possible only for Palestinians, because the way it is drafted makes that it will only be implemented for Palestinians. And the very problematic stuff is that it doesn't require absolute majority of the judges. It can be just a basic majority. And there is few possibilities of appeal, and it has to be implemented 90 days after it has been decided. And with this, they say that they do not want any more prison exchange. So it's also a complete shift in the way to confront also this system. And what I try to show with the the carceral generation, is at each period you have a new carceral system in a way, because it evolves through time, and you have new ways to confront it, and the way people deal with it, the new porosities or not porosities and this kind of things. So now it's an open, we have a new something new is coming, and we don't have till now all the elements to understand it and to see the effects. Will this definitely okay, the law has passed, but will it be implemented for good? Will a new government that might come change it? Well, okay, it's still open, but I'm not very optimistic, to be honest. Mm.
Thank you, Professor. I'm very sorry because now the time is over. I wanted to know more things about this issue. Anyway, I want that you know that the book of Professor Sthepahnie can be circulated in our seminar. We have a PDF in English version, in order that you can get it. I mean, in French, you can get it online. However, we have the English version, and I hope that with the help of Cátedra Jorge Alonso and Claxo, we can look for the translation into Spanish, as Margarita Millán was telling us. Professor Sthepahnie, thank you very much for your time. I know now is late in France. I hope that you are not so busy in your agenda. I'm very sorry for taking your time, but at the same time, we are very grateful for your support and for this masterclass that you have shared with us this morning here in Mexico and this evening in Europe. From my heart, if you have some more questions, I will be delighted to send it to Professor Sthepahnie, hoping that this cannot be the last time that we have class with her. Thank you very much, Professor Sthepahnie, and thank you everyone for being here with us. The next session will be next week, and we will be studying the issue of evangelist elite in Trump's administration and the support of Israel with Professor Marcel Álvarez Pérez. Will be in Spanish, so don't worry. And I will be writing you with the details of connection and so on. Gracias, Profesor Sthepahnie.
Y
Muchas
ya puede
gracias. Muchas gracias.
en español porque ya es para nosotros más. Bueno, tenemos aquí dos preguntas que también las tiene Stephanie y seguramente vamos a poder ir contestando más adelante. Muchísimas gracias por esta sesión.
Muchas gracias a vosotros y vosotras. Y bueno, he hablado mucho y por eso no habíamos tenido mucho tiempo para las preguntas, pero I'm sorry about that. But
No, no,
No, don't
no.
be sorry. It was you have too much to say. Thank you very much.
No, I think it's very important what you have shared with us in order that that we can understand the landscape of the issue, and then we will have another chance to make that kind of feedback or another session if you have time. More or less we have, well, moreover, we will have the book and the opportunity to have your paper and the paper of other colleagues. And then will we have another chance, I'm sure, to have a feedback to write you. And we will spend time in obtain the another book that you have mentioned, the book of 2025, in order to make this more deeper and more understandable for our audience here in Latin America, Professor. So don't worry. We are very appreciated and we are very grateful for your time and for your dissertation today. Thank you from my heart. Thank you, Professor Sthepahnie.
muchas gracias. Adiós.
Gracias a todos. Hasta pronto.
Hasta pronto.
Gracias.